What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality. Spirituality. How do they diver? How do they diver? How do they diver? How do they convert? How do they convert? How do they convert? How are we different? How are we different? How are we different? How are we the same? How are we the same? How are we the same? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality.
This is Angelo John Lewis for the Diversity and Spirituality Network podcast. In case you're not familiar with us, the Diversity and Spirituality Network is an emerging community who are actively exploring the integration of diversity and spirituality. We have different takes as to what that's like, but for me personally, I see diversity as nothing less than a sacred path in and of itself. And I'd like to invite you to rate the podcast on iTunes or wherever you get podcasts, which goes a long way to helping us spread the word. Today, I'm privileged to interview Robert Leventhal, who's a leadership specialist in the Kehilla Strengthening Department of the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, which is the largest network of conservative Jews in the world. Prior to joining the USCJ, Bob was a Jewish communal lay leader in Dayton, Ohio, and he also had a synagogue consulting practice at the Alban Institiute in Herndon, Virginia. And the Alban Institiute primarily serves mainline Protestant congregations. Robert has worked with hundreds of congregations and organizations such as the Yeshiva University, United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, the UGA Federation of New York, and federations in Montreal, Toronto, Houston, Northern New Jersey, and Palm Beach. He's the author of several books, including Stepping Forward, Synagogue Visioning and Planning, and Biachad, Synagogue Board Development. Robert, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Angelo.
Robert, give us a sense of your religious and spiritual upbringing.
Sure. You know, my father grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, which is a much bigger Jewish community, and his father came from Russia, was not well educated in the secular world, but was very knowledgeable Jewishly, and they belonged to an Orthodox congregation where my grandfather was a leader. Even though it was the Depression, Jewish issues were very important. But when he struck out from Ohio State to find his own way, he bought a little business in a town of Springfield, Ohio, which had almost no Jewish learning and almost no Jewish environment. And the only synagogue there was an ultra-reform liberal congregation, and that's where he committed himself. So he went to an outpost with a focus on his business and economic opportunity, not necessarily choosing it for Jewish community. And that would lead to a variety of things. One, I grew up in a school where I was often the only Jewish child in my classroom. In the third grade, I had to go and sit in the library because they had prayer in the classrooms. So much of my early identity is about being a minority and trying to figure out, am I ashamed of being a Jew or am I actually proud of it?
Now, as you know, the Jewish religion is very complicated. You know, there's lots of different denominations and branches, and you, of all people, are very versed in having, I'll call that dialogue between different sort of groups. And I'm wondering what that process is like, and you know, what are some of the difficulties and maybe joys of doing same?
Well, you know, it's true. If I look at my current practice, it's very important for me to understand Reform, Conservative, Orthodox congregations, or even within the conservative movement, all the various approaches which are on a continuum. And I developed certain attitudes toward diversity really in Springfield, Ohio, where we had 150 Jews. And we came to the conclusion that even though some were Orthodox and some were liberal and some were secular, if we didn't all pull together, we just wouldn't have a Jewish community. So the whole idea of stepping up was sort of a fundamental given, and I've brought that to the work I have here. Often people will say to me, you don't understand, we're not that involved, or we're not that engaged, or we're not that united. And I go to them, you know, as a consultant, it's essential that I be clear about that data. That's your context and that's your environment. But I would have never chosen to give up the business world and go into congregational consulting if I didn't have that fundamental sense that we need to all pull together to build community, and that should transcend some of these differences.
Well, you told me earlier, Robert, that a lot of your training was with the Alban Institute, and their whole thing was around, I guess I'll call it interreligious dialogue. And I'm wondering how that work influenced the work that you're doing now.
Well, I was a businessman for 23 years. So my original framing is marketing and sales and business accountability, a whole different culture. And when I was in religious life, it was as a volunteer on boards and community organizations. When I switched out of business and went to the Alban Institute on a grant to become their first Jewish consultant, I sort of had to walk into that space in a very humble stance because I knew a lot about goal setting and driving business change, but not much about listening to congregations. And that was their gift. I'm quite the extrovert. They were a highly introverted and reflective organization that was very much into understanding empathetically and inquiring first and advocating their opinions second. So I would say the first thing that helped me see differences and be open to them was just learning to be a better observer of what is, as opposed to bouncing in like a bull in a china shop, trying to suggest they do this or they do that. As a culture, they were made up with all kinds of different mainline Protestant faith traditions. It was not an organization that worked with the Catholic Church. And it was not an organization that had much connection to the evangelical community. So this was a wide group of people from mainline Protestants, Lutherans, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Unitarians, Methodists, and so on. But each of those cultures have their own approach. Each of them have a certain kind of approach to governance. So one of the issues was, how can we learn from each other? How can you unpack the wisdom of working with Methodists so that if I'm working with Unitarians, I can bring some of that knowledge? And because we were a consulting firm where people would need to be able to work with different groups, we were sort of a culture where you learn to take your tool chest and put those tools on the table of the boardroom, even though the context in which you were working might be different from time to time.
That's interesting. It's kind of like what consultants do in general. If we divorce it from the religious context. In other words, we learn things in different organizations that we work with, and hopefully we take the best of what we learn to new organizations, and hopefully keep employed at the same time.
Yes, we sometimes laugh about how the jobs we take that we were not fully prepared for, and what we learn, and how we then use it for the next congregation.
Right.
It's definitely part of a consultant's tool chest.
Now, I know that your specific expertise is, well, one of your expertise, as I say, is to helping Jewish congregations revive themselves. But I'd like to kind of universalize this a little bit, because when I look at things like the Pew studies of religious values, you find that there's like a slow decline in people that are practicing in I'll call it a mainstream religious context. So we could talk really about the Jewish context if you like, but what is your sense as to why some of the memberships are declining in some of these groups?
Well, I would say one of Alban's great priorities was to be empathetic and understanding, and to walk side by side with the American clergy person. And one of the ways in which they tried to hold that relationship was by acknowledging that when lay leaders of a synagogue or congregation criticize or pressure or push their clergy person, like why aren't you doing this and why aren't you doing that, that there's a larger context, and that the vast majority, more than the majority, of many of the things that are impacting our congregations are actually outside of the control of the clergy. We have force fields, to use Kurt Lewin's term, that are much bigger. If you think of them, the height of the force field of change is so much greater then the box called congregational leadership capacity and resource capacity. And whenever that happens, you're going to have a lot of anxiety, and your ability to respond is going to be really challenged. We often say of people, of leaders in that system facing the giant force field, they often fail to be able to understand what's going on, what's going wrong. And when you can't figure out what's going wrong, you will often pivot to ask who is going wrong. And the blame of that often falls on clergy and committed core leaders in this time of change. So what is that force field that you're asking about? Well, United States is clearly more religious than Europe and many parts of the world. It's still a big part of our culture. But in the 40s and 50s, it was just part of American life to belong to a congregation. It's what Ozzie and Harriet did. And Jews wanted their synagogue on the same main street, just like their suburban friends and relatives. There was a level of respectability. After all, who built all that? The GI generation. The GI generation were builders, and the GI generation was joiners. After all, they all put on a uniform and won a war. They were the greatest generation of a kind of institutional building, and they brought that camaraderie and sort of company man attitude to building societies. And you would go to the church or synagogue that your parents went to, and you cared about showing up and looking good for the Joneses and being a good, upright citizen. Well, that's the GI generation. In the 60s, we have a rebellion against all that kind of established culture and structure. The baby boomers are different. And in the world we live, it's just continued. So if you look at Pew, you'll find generation after generation, they're less committed to organizational life. It doesn't mean they don't have commitments, but the idea of that they're loyal to the institutions their parents built. My father built the synagogue in Springfield, Ohio. My uncle was the president at the time. The idea that we'd have to belong to synagogues and have to be kind of stand-up people, that was in our DNA. That's not the case for many today. People don't feel they have to. In fact, Judaism, until this kind of Enlightenment period in Europe and then the era in America, until the last couple hundred years, the non-Jewish world defined what a Jew could do, and Jews had ethnic enclaves. They had to belong to synagogue. They had to be supported by their community. You wouldn't want to live outside those walls. Well, that's not the world we live. We have great mobility and fluidity today. Anti-Semitism doesn't drive most Jews to synagogues. Social norms do not shame most Jews into feeling they have to belong to a congregation. So now we're in an era, we've left the era of I have to, and we're entered the area where I need to choose to. And I can tell you as a businessman, I'd prefer to have customers who have to. It takes a lot of work to help people want to choose you over and over again. That's very hard work for the institutions, but that's actually the environment which we face ourselves in today.
So obviously you have to give them something that they want to choose, this new group of people, some of whom are millennials, for example, not necessarily practice churchgoers. What are some strategies that you use? How do you go about doing that?
Well, again, the first thing is a certain just humility and kind of social awareness. They don't share the same assumptions that the people that built these synagogues do. They have their own lifestyles and they have core values that we can relate to, but we're not going to be able to get them to show up. That's a good term. Just when we want them to in the way we want them to. So I was working with a congregation in Florida, and the president was complaining to me, the young people just don't do anything. They don't, but even the ones that join here, they don't show up. And I interviewed the rabbi and other people and found out actually they're coming on Friday and they're coming to holiday events with their kids. They just have no interest to come to the Saturday morning service where this woman goes. And for her, if they're not showing up at 10:15, they're not showing up. That type of attitude is deadly in terms of engaging millennials. They expect to be able to find what they want, when they want it, in the format they want it, how they want it, at the price they want it. They're used to navigating the internet. I'm not saying the Jewish community should turn on its head and become consumerist. I think, as far as I'm concerned, people need to meet you halfway. But this old attitude that the only way that Judaism can be expressed is my way is simply not going to work. And many of our congregations, my system, are like fortresses, and they create posters called "We Want to Welcome You," but beyond the poster, they're still acting the way they did 10 years ago, and that's simply not going to work. So what does work? Meeting people where they are. Sometimes it means that instead of Saturday, it'll be Sunday, and we'll get babysitting for them. Maybe we let them organize their own picnic, not ours, and let them bubble up their ideas. Maybe they don't want a book club at noon where the retired people are. It's not practical, but they might enjoy a speaker series shaped the way they want it to. So what you're moving to, if you recognize this next generational change, is more of a bubble up culture where you find what they want and let them self-organize to do it, rather than sitting in your ivory tower behind your GI generation fortress, casting down proposals called "Why won't they go to this and why won't they go to that?" My view is, in terms of synagogue leadership change, I always preach, if I'm going to create a next generation engagement strategy, or any engagement strategies, I need both new ideas and the people to drive them. Having centralized rabbis and presidents and education chairs sit there cooking up all the things and throwing it against the wall in this era simply leads to frustration. I'd much rather caucus people together and, like in an open space environment, see what kinds of things they want to work on and then help organize them to do it. In that sense, I'm more of a guide on the side than a seer on the stage. I'm helping them, I'm facilitating them, I'm resourcing them, but I'm not trying to guess everything that they might have energy for.
Now, one of the things I know you've written about, and probably you practice also, is using organizational development principles to basically revive membership, let's say. Can you give me, without being overly technical, can you give me some sort of sense as to what that looks like?
Well, if I'm entering, or my team of people at United Synagogue are engaging a congregation, we're trying to figure out what stage of their congregational history they're in and what are the challenges at each stage. It's different for a startup than a 100-year-old congregation. It's different for a congregation going through its growth spurt versus someone that's in the decline. But for each stage, we have to deal with a couple things. We have to be diagnostic to figure out what's going on. We have to gather facts, or we have to have them acknowledge certain facts, because without shared understanding of key facts, how can we do anything next? So there's always some kind of data gathering part of any inquiry. But just making lists of the facts, or even what often flows, lists of the problems, doesn't necessarily move people forward. Because what happens, particularly in an environment that I've described where the force fields are very difficult, is we may end up simply creating what I call the problem-saturated story. Basically, woe is us. Let me tell you, the young people won't, and we're running out of money, and the building's tired, and why isn't it like the 50s? And why aren't people coming to my pet event? And woe is me. But the problem is, energy goes to energy. What new member wants to join to hear all that problem-saturated story? So in a recent article I wrote, I try to practice what I call blended organizational development, where I use diagnosis because I just need a certain sense of reality. But a lot of what I need to do actually is to help them find what they're good at, what they can do, and do some kind of strengths-based planning. A congregation may be small, but they're gifted in one narrow area. Maybe they're an arts-oriented synagogue. Maybe music is good for them. Building on that is better than trying to make lists of all the things they aren't. I was taught at Alban that we're not here to fix synagogues, but to help them be the best they can be. And as a practical matter, that kind of strengths-based focus is simply practical because it allows people to hear you. You can write all the beautiful diagnostic Gnostic strategic plans, which tell them all the things to be fixed. It's just that there's nobody who has any energy or hopefulness to do it. And there's a famous biblical passage that's often quoted in Jewish world about the biblical spies. They were tasked by Moses to go into the land of Canaan and scout it out and describe its strengths and weaknesses, but also its blessings. And he then came up and said, one thing I demand that you do, bring back some of the fruit of the land. And so there's actually the symbol of Israel tourism are these two people carrying this giant cluster of grapes. Why grapes? Well, I argue, and this was a major text in my book, Stepping Forward, without some tangible, visceral, palpable sense of the sweetness of a promised future, who has the energy to do this work? We need some hopeful, forward-looking vision. We can't simply live in all the problem inventories that we have. So maintaining hope is actually one of the biggest challenges in working in synagogues. And if you look at the challenges mainline Protestant churches have, they have the same. I wrote an article that riffed off several Protestant writers just 6 months ago called about facing decline and finding hope. Are you going to be the kind of person that simply stands at your doorway trying to count how many people did not come to services today? Or are you going to inspire people to go out into the community and do the kinds of things that make people wonder, what are these people drinking in their lemonade? Mm-hmm. And how do I get more of that? One is an external lens. It's a building lens. It's a generative lens. It's a hopeful lens. And it's about doing, not counting. But the research, particularly with next generation Jews, is they are often most motivated to participate in communities that have a social justice edge to them, that have an external lens, not a petty lens, a lens towards service, whether it's tutoring corps or homeless shelters or clothing drives or food pantries, as opposed to the kind of quibbling debates we often get in our board meetings about, who's going to run this event and why didn't it go my way last year. That's not, in a world where you don't have to join, that's not what you're going to join for.
Yeah, and I hear a strong flavor of what some people refer to as appreciative inquiry in terms of focus on the positive as opposed to kind of, woe is me sort of approach.
As a businessman, my family business was Cedar, the cleaning products business. We did a lot of problem solving. We did make lists and of things to work on each year in our plans. And so being a problem solver and focusing on stuff to fix was very much part of my business mentality. We call that deficit or gap analysis, what's missing. But it's really evolved over time out of practical experience that I found that there needed to be both. In a famous book by Posner and Kouzes called Leadership, the Challenge, they reported the research that said the two most important qualities of a leader, one, an honest, accurate understanding of the lay of the land, tell the truth, tell the hard truth, and right behind it, a hopeful, forward-looking vision. So to me, they're really glued together. They're all part of the same equation. In order to be an effective leader, I need to live between those two principles and be informed by both poles, like a polarity. And practical experience taught me that. And then as I got more involved in the field of organizational development, I found that there's actually theory about that. And the theory and the colleagues who preach it have given me a little more backbone, if you will, to stay on that, to look into it, to try new things. And the last several years, I've been doing a lot of stuff with kind of strengths-based work, more than I did 10 years ago.
One of the things you mentioned, which I think is interesting, is this emphasis or the interest in social justice among some of the people that you've been working with. And being a person of a certain age, I remember that pretty much I don't want to say the only group, but one of the major groups that was active in the civil rights movement that was doing sort of cross cross-group, let's say, work were Jewish people. And, and when I look at not just Jewish, but I look at some other religious trends right now, I wonder to the degree social justice is right now. Is the emphasis still as strong among the people that you talk to, or is it declining, or is it vary, or what is your sense of that?
I think, and I can speak best about the non-Orthodox Jewish world, the Reform and Conservative and Renewal and Reconstruction, which is like 80% of the Jewish community is in the liberal non-Orthodox world. That group's always had a very strong sense of social justice. They may not have been so historically ritually oriented or observant in terms of coming to services. They may not be so focused on God talk in the way that certain Christian groups are. But the idea that you express your faithfulness by social justice is a very fundamental principle. When we come to the synagogue to stand in memory of a parent or friend that's passed away, it's not uncommon at all to be told the way to show you respect and honor this person are by giving acts of kindness and justice. So at its very core, since Jews have a very, very, undeveloped sense of the afterlife, it was a religion created to be focused on the world here by far. Absolutely. It was a here and now religion. So doing deeds of social justice on earth when you're here is job one. And I think it still is. I do think as we got very comfortable economically and so on, maybe some of us are not as active as we were. But the next generation of people, this is actually one of the bright spots because they have a strong sense of justice. Just look at the research on next generation's attitude toward race, toward gender, toward sexual preference. All those things, they are very inclusive and very open-minded about the rights of all and needs of all of these people. That type of an attitude is going to express itself in social justice. And they're also blending this kind of next generation network, internet approach toward entrepreneurial new projects. So for all the struggles of some of the mainline synagogues to attract these people, there is a whole world of entrepreneurial startups outside of the synagogue world that has been capturing this. And the savvy synagogue membership engagement people should be looking at that and asking, what's the secret sauce? What's the secret sauce that allows these other kinds of institutions to get a growing share of the hearts and minds of our younger people?
Now, you talked about millennials, and we also talked a little bit about the Pew studies about religious life. And I guess it leads to kind of a broad question. I'm just curious as to what your experience and observation are. It seems that to some extent, one could make the case that the institutional church, be it Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish, is in a steady state of decline. So I'm wondering, what is your sense as to sort of the future of religion in general? And do you think it's going to still serve the needs, perhaps as it did 20 years ago, or does it need to evolve to maintain relevance in an increasingly secular world?
Well, I just think that I happen to believe in congregations, that congregations do some really wonderful things. In the Jewish world, I often say of our synagogue congregations, we build Jews that other parts of the Jewish world and general community use. So it's great that we give people a sense of spiritual knowledge and certain religious practices and a shared set of values and let them practice being in community, being a constructive contributor to community. That's part of what we're trying to teach every week in a congregation. Those are wonderful skills for other nonprofits when those Jewish people go to them. We're building and constructing Jewish lives at our best that allows all these other institutions to benefit from them. I don't think that will disappear. What I do think is that these many congregations built in the 40s and 50s out of a certain Jewish enclave and ethnic enclave. After all, in the early 60s in Springfield, Ohio, a Jewish person couldn't belong to the Chamber of Commerce or in Rotary. So if you needed fellowship, you needed a synagogue. This was your home. Now those walls are, there's still anti-Semitism and there's still some issues, but the world that we live in does not represent the one of the 40s and 50s. After all, a study that was done of returning American soldiers found that a majority of them felt that the Jews had brought this on themselves. Anti-Semitism was pervasive. It was going to change, but it was still carried. That's not the world we're in now. So that kind of ethnic enclave, I don't think will be reproduced and go forward, meaning that the ones that survive are going to have to reimagine themselves as communities of choice. Not all will make it. So will there be less in 10 years? Probably. But the ones that do make it, I think will still be able to make a great contribution. The second thing is, it's so easy to, because I work in the synagogue business, to see that all Jewish vitality or communal vitality is defined in terms of my institution. But in fact, there are all kinds of disruptive groups. There are all kinds of groups that are having networks of people going for Shabbos dinner, networks of people that learn and meet in people's homes, networks of people who have retreat centers, people that share literature, people that see streaming services, people that do this, people that do that. That world is going on. Is that going to compete for some of these people? Most certainly it is. Are legacy, long-standing synagogues the best suited to do these disruptive new things? No, they're the ones being disruptive. But the best of them can learn from these disruptions and be able to be a bridge from what is to what might be in a good way. And those places are going to survive and have meaningful futures.
I guess a last question, a personal question, Robert. You've been active, I guess, in Jewish organizational life really for a lot of your professional career. So I'm wondering, how do you sort of keep yourself invigorated? What do you do? What is your sort of spiritual religious practice that keeps you sort of connected to Yahweh or whatever word you want to use?
Well, we have a nice commitment to Saturday morning services. My wife and I go every Saturday. I go whether I'm in the mood to or not. These are my friends. Sometimes parts of the service speak to me, sometimes they don't. But collectively, the whole idea of being in a community, I see children running around, I see bar mitzvahs of 13-year-olds, I see funerals of older people, I see people in sickness and in joy. Our texts remind me that these fundamental values conversations have gone on for years, and I like to be in sort of the chain of tradition. I like that a lot. I go to Torah study, which often I do that happens before services. I always have Jewish books on my dresser next to my bed, and so being a reader and a reflector on Jewish themes is just part of my work. And of course, I work in the Jewish world where even if I'm working with a synagogue, I often walk into the sanctuary on break when they're in their breakout groups and enjoy a moment of meditation and reflection. So I'm living in New York. It's an easy place to do that. I'm living right in the center of the rhythms of Jewish living, and I have habits at this point in my life. The other thing is I took the initiative. I sort of just grabbed at this opportunity and wrote a curriculum for baby boomers. And I'm 67, just turned 67. And I did a lot of research on the issues of baby boomers in general: health, work, retirement, sandwich generation of your grown children and your aging parents, spirituality, legacy, friendship. And I dug deep. I did real heavy heavy lift to read primary sources about what Judaism had to say about all this. And I designed this workshop for baby boomers. I've had 15 congregations test it out. We're just getting into the revisions. That was absolutely transformative because I've learned something years ago. When I force myself and prepare myself to teach a thing, my learning of a thing becomes intense. And so as I've prepared to create these curriculum for baby boomer discussions all over the country, I found my own spiritual inner life light up. I've been writing and reflecting and mulling. Sometimes in the heart of all that curriculum, I called out to a friend I hadn't talked to in 10 years because I'd unfinished business. But if I hadn't started this inquiry, I don't know that I'd have made that call. And I think that's part of how I try to manage my inner life.
Okay, that's wonderful, Bob. I have a sort of a link to you in the USCJ community. Is there any other way that you want people to contact you if for example, they wanted to know about this new curriculum you've developed?
Anybody that's picking this up and wants to reach out, the best way is just to email me at leventhal@uscj.org, and I'm happy to hear it and get back to you and to engage in a conversation.
Well, that's great. I'm going to just sort of wrap up with a few words on the Diversity and Spirituality Network, Robert, and then I'll sort of thank you formally, I guess. Those of you that want to know more about the Diversity and Spirituality Network, the easiest way is to join our private Facebook group, which you can find by going to Facebook and searching for Diversity and Spirituality. You can also come to our regular events. We have online and offline events. Easiest are our online events, which are the third Saturday every month. You can go to our website, diversityandspiritualitynetwork.com, look under events. And finally, if you really like the podcast and want to support it, you can do it on Patreon by going to patreon.com. For as little as $1 a day, you can, in effect, become a sponsor of the show. Bob, it's a great privilege to know you. I hope we can stay in touch, and I'm planning on coming to visit you in New York real soon. So thanks a lot for being my guest.
Pleasure.
What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality?